Welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today I'm going to be talking about a book that I highly recommend that we read to understand the culture from a Christian standpoint, to understand what's happening in our world today, and as Christians to be able to answer questions that are posed to us from non-Christians and even fellow Christians in concerning the issue of feminism. There's a book out by Susan Venker. It's called The Flip-Side of Feminism. Highly recommend this book. This was also promoted on Family Talk with James Dobson. He was interviewing both authors, Susan Venker and Phyllis Schlafly. Now, Phyllis Schlafly has deceased. She's gone on to be with the Lord, but Susan Venker, who is pictured here, is the younger of the two, and she is the primary author of this book, but Phyllis Schlafly did contribute also. But it talks about the myth of feminism as a good in our society. A lot of people, you'll talk to people, even Christians, and you'll get the idea that, hey, you know, the feminist movement, we owe a lot to the feminist movement for improving our culture, improving our society. They have won important rights for women and opened doors for women in culture and the workplace and society. And so the feminist movement is really good. There may be some excesses, but overall the feminist movement is good. That's the myth. This book, The Flip Side of Feminism, actually dismantles those myths and talks about the terrible disaster that the feminist movement has brought upon society and life in the 20th and 21st century. One of the things it starts talking about, and it goes through chapter by chapter, all kinds of different issues, and it talks about, for example, chapter 1 is marked Brainwashed. Chapter 2, Feminism 101, Uncensored. Chapter 3, Hookups and Heartache. Chapter 4, Why Marriage Eludes the Modern Generation. Chapter 5, When Mothers Work. Chapter 6, Pandering to the Female Left at Your Expense. Chapter 7, The Expendable Male. And Chapter 8, A New Roadmap for Women. Now, it goes through and it talks about all of the issues that are surrounding feminism and the feminist movement. And it really exposes feminism for what it really is, not what the newspapers and the news media want you to think feminism is. They want you to think that feminism is just this one of the greatest goods that's ever come upon a society. They want you to think that feminism is this great movement that has given us all kinds of blessings in society, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. For example, one instance, comes from the introduction of the book. Susan Venker is reflecting on her college days. She went to a typical college or university, liberal. If you go to any college, any university, unless perhaps it's a Christian university, but again, here you can't always count on a Christian university or college to be non-feminist. But most colleges and universities, especially state, are controlled, dominated by feminist ideology. And so this is what Susan Venker says. She said that when she went through college, she was different. And she says, I was different from my girlfriends in a way. They didn't give any thought to marriage and motherhood when making decisions about their lives, whereas I assumed marriage and motherhood would be the center of my life. Thus, I chose a career at that time, it was teaching, that would best accommodate motherhood. I always knew I would work outside the home, but I never expected my career to become my life. For if I wasn't a feminist downgrading the role of wife and mother and planning an exciting career to liberate me from home, well, then I must be conservative. Okay, so what she's saying is that in the colleges and universities of our nation, for many decades now, the dominant ideology has been feminism. And the assumption of feminism is that every girl is supposed to be pursuing a career. She's supposed to be pursuing work outside the home. She is supposed to be training for the workplace, for the corporate world. And the higher and more powerful job she can get, the more better pay she can get, it's supposed to further the feminist cause, because it seems like the feminist cause is to empower women and girls, to empower them, literally empower them, to put them in positions of power so that they can then put other women in positions of power, because that is the perceived evil in the world, that women aren't in more positions of power. So under the feminist paradigm, one of the big problems with our world and one of the big problems with our society is that there are not more women in positions of power, because women need to be in more positions of power to correct the wrongs that men do in positions of power. And so the diagnosis for society is to just put women in positions of power, put them in positions of influence, get more and more and more and more women in leadership positions, and then the world will be a better place. That's the assumption of the feminist movement. And it piggybacks on the assumption that men are ruining the world. Men in positions of power are causing all kinds of problems in the world, and those problems can be reversed if more and more and more women can be trained, can be empowered, and put into positions of influence in society and leadership. And the more, the better it is for society. Under the feminist paradigm, it would be really great if all the political leaders in Washington were women, all the leaders in corporate America on the boards, board of directors, CEO, all the directors, important positions of power at all the major corporations were women. It would be better, because the idea is that men are messing up the world and men are ruining everything for everyone, and so women need to save the day. And you see this same theme in the popular movies that are coming out left and right in Hollywood. For example, you see this happening in the Star Wars franchise, where you see that women are now in positions of being the heroes, being the ones that save the men, save the children, save the other women. There's all kinds of feminist, empower women messages in the Star Wars franchise. It's to the point where the last few Star Wars have been pretty bad, and the critics have even panned them for their overplaying this feminine card, this feminist card, by putting women in very unrealistic positions in scenarios in the Star Wars franchise. Now, it's not just Star Wars, it's all kinds of other movies. We saw this Captain Marvel that came out, and here's a woman. She's supposed to be a strong, powerful superhero woman, and she comes in to rescue humanity, and she is able to get into fights, and nothing ever touches her. She's always able to come out victorious. And it's just a theme now in Hollywood that we see almost every single movie that comes out. The latest one being, at the time of this video, the Terminator franchise, where now the latest Terminator is the protectors are the women. There's the new hero of the movie is a Mexican girl who's 13, and she's the one that's supposed to save the world. And even though the franchise was based on this young boy, John Connor, he was the one that was going to bring down the evil Skynet. So it's totally been reversed, and now it's this young Mexican girl, and she's going to be the hero. And she's being protected by superheroes that are women. And the whole thing revolves around the women being strong and powerful and heroes and conquerors and warriors. And it totally, totally comes across unrealistic, because it is unrealistic. It's a little bit like what happens, for example, when you try to argue that it's just as important for women's sports to exist as it is for men's sports to exist in high school, in college, and so forth. It's not as important that women have women's sports in high school and college as it is for men to have boys and men to have sports in college, because the reason why there are sports for boys and men is because these are the soldiers that are needed to defend the homeland. The reason why we want boys and men to have these physical outlets is because it's a form of training for them to be prepared. They're going to have to defend the family. They're going to have to defend their wives. They're going to have to defend their children. And so they need to stay sharp, and they need to begin to learn how to conduct themselves and learn how to be physical and learn how to control their energy and control their power and their muscles and be coordinated and develop coordination and so forth, because they're going to be called upon in the future to fight the battles. In the last century, the 20th century, we had two major battles. We had World War I and World War II. And it was the men who primarily went to war. And that's the way it has to be. It has to be men primarily fighting in the battles, because men are physically equipped to fight in battles, whereas women are not physically equipped to fight in battles. If you were to send all the women in the United States at the time of World War I and train them for combat and then send them over to Europe, it would have been a disaster. Why? Because they're not physically capable of fighting the way men are physically capable of fighting. They lack the muscle power. They lack the structure, skeletal structure. They lacked so many different attributes, and that's why society has always found ways to train the young boys and train the men to keep them able and equipped for battle. And so we have sports in society, we have sports in schools to sort of get them into that scene, and we're training them for, in case, heaven forbid, but in case we have another war, then they're ready. They're not having to just be thrown out there with no preparation. Whereas the women and the girls don't need that kind of training. They don't need that. They don't need that physically, because they're not as physically aggressive and they don't have that kind of energy. And they don't need that for the fighting of the battles, because they're not going to be pushed into combat duty the way the men are doing. So you have reasons why men and boys sports are a necessity, and they're a necessity in the way that women's sports are not a necessity. And there's a lot to that we don't actually have time to go into. But again, the feminist ideology says, oh, all of that doesn't matter. Women can do whatever men can do. They can do just as well as men can do. And these are not true. These are myths. And all you need to do is consult the physical study, the science, sports science, and you will find out that women cannot do physically what men can do physically in the area of sports. And so we're dealing with myths. We're dealing with feminist myths in society that are so clearly myths, but because of the feminist ideology that dominates universities and colleges and the media, we are not allowed to talk about that. Well, Susan Venker, in her book, The Flip-Side of Feminism, actually talks about these and does a very good job of it. So she says in college, the vast majority of girls in college, they didn't give any thought to marriage and motherhood when making decisions about their lives. Why didn't they? Because they were trained not to. Feminist ideology says you don't train for motherhood, you don't train for home management, you don't train for child rearing, because those things are put upon you by the patriarchy to hold you back. And so to be liberated from marriage and motherhood, you need to pursue a career outside the home. And if later on you feel the urge to have a marriage and be a mother, that's okay, maybe, but the real women, the real feminists are out there earning high salaries, pursuing powerful positions in corporations and politics, and those are the real role models. And you see that all over the media. The assumption is that if you're a real woman, you're going to be a powerful woman in the world's eyes, and you're going to have positions of power and influence, and it's all about power. It's all about power. And Susan Venker was very perplexed at the fact that here were these girls in college spending thousands and thousands of dollars, going deep in debt to get an education, and it didn't have any kind of plan or goal in mind for motherhood, for marriage. It was all about vocation and career at the time. And she said, this is crazy. And she says, I'm going to choose a career that would fit in really nicely with my marriage and motherhood goals and plans. And so that's what she did. And so she bucked the system. She went against the feminist ideology that is ruling at the university and college level. And she actually trained to be a teacher with the goal, her real goal was marriage and family. And she would find that a lot of the skills that she would learn in the teaching profession, she could apply to marriage and motherhood. But that was against the feminist ideology. In fact, if you're a woman in a college or university and you actually say, my goal in life is to be married and be a mother of children and raise children and keep home, you will be looked down upon. You will be ostracized. You will be put down. You'll be seen as a traitor to your gender, because those are things that the feminists say are worthless. Those are things that they say the patriarchy, the evil patriarchy, men in society have put women into those roles for the men's sake. And so they say those are bad things. We need to break out of those molds, and we have to reject those molds and get out of the family home and get out of this burden of child raising and all these feminist slogans and everything. These are the things that have been destroying our nation and our society for the last few decades, that this book, The Flip-Side of Feminism, brings out. And it's really interesting. She also says, according to the media elite, the mainstream newspapers, magazines, and television networks that set the news agenda, conservatism has no place in the discussion of female empowerment. When women in the media, most of whom are committed feminists, discuss the state of women in America, is always from a left-wing perspective. And they always talk about the evil patriarchy and toxic masculinity now. That's the big phrase, toxic masculinity. And how we need more women in positions of power to correct the mistakes that the men in position of power are making. And so this book totally contradicts the mainstream feminist philosophy that is all over our society. Here's she talks another time. Feminists use benign terminology, women's rights, reproductive rights, violence against women to appeal to people's emotions and marginalize those who disagree, making them sound backwards and provincial. So a lot of the arguments for feminism are not really arguments. They're not really rational arguments. They're not really based on any verifiable data. For example, the women's pay gap. This is another major feminist talking point. The feminists claim that there's a major pay gap between men and women in the Western world, and the reason for that pay gap is because of the evil patriarchy that men are trying to hold women down because men want to stay in power and they want to put women in their place and keep them out of influential positions and so on and so forth. When you actually look into the causes, the real reasons based on facts why there is a gender pay gap between women who work in the Western world and men who work in the Western world, you will find that it isn't nearly as simple as simply saying it's the patriarchy is holding women back. No, a lot of the reasons are simply very practical reasons. Women want the option to be able to have children. They want the flexibility in their schedules to take off time if their children need them, if there's something at school. They want flexibility, and they're willing to give up a certain amount of upward mobility. They're willing to give up a salary to have a position wherever it might be, in a corporation or in any company, where they have more flexible hours, that they aren't under so much pressure to succeed, to climb. They're not willing to, for example, stay longer hours typically, whereas a man might be willing to, and the statistics bear this out, that men who are climbing the corporate ladder are willing to put in a lot more hours and sacrifice a lot more to get what they want, position, a power, or influence. And women tend to want to have more time and flexibility. They want to be able to leave the career, have a child, raise a child for the first few years, and then jump back into a career. Well, when you do that, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table. You're going to have transition back into the workplace problems. You're not going to rise as fast as the men who don't do that. And you're also not going to get as paid as much as the men who don't do that. So there are all kinds of factors that go into the gender pay gap, and it's not centered primarily on the so-called patriarchy holding women back. So all of these arguments, they're not really arguments by the feminists, they're emotional appeals. They're more feeling-based, gut feeling, emotional appeals that, hey, we're not getting paid as much because the men are trying to hold us back, and that kind of thing. And this book talks about that, and it dismantles those arguments. And it talks about some of the realities of the feminism that aren't talked a lot about, and that is the deep regret that a lot of women have when they follow the feminist plan, an agenda. They get past their childbearing years. They've focused on career. They don't have a family. They're not in a stable marriage or relationship because they've sacrificed all for that position of power because the feminist ideology told them to pursue that above everything else. And they realize when they get older, they're lonely. They don't have the family and the children around them that they had hoped. Many of them are guilt-ridden, it says, stressed out, saddled with a psychological need to prove importance in the world. So they're still trying to follow the feminist agenda, and it causes all kinds of psychological needs, depression, anxiety. They're often even the younger feminists who are climbing the corporate ladder and pursuing independent careers, they have a hard time dating. They have a hard time finding a man who will accept them because they're willing to sacrifice those relationships to climb the corporate ladder. Now, in the traditional family structure, where the woman worked in the home, raised the children, kept the home, and the man was out there, left home in the morning, worked all day long, and if need be, even stayed hours after hours to get the job done. He would come home, and the home was ordered, and there was calmness, and there was warmth and love in the family because the wife had been there and the mother had been there and taken care of the children. Now the feminists are out there working those long hours, or trying to, along with the men. When they come home, there is no order. It isn't a warm home. Oftentimes they feel stressed out because now they're wanting to come home to a home that's all been kept and ordered, and no one's there to do that. And so again, there's all these problems. It says here in the introduction, Americans who don't believe women in this country are oppressed. She's talking about her perspective. There are many Americans who don't believe women in this country are oppressed, who know government is not the solution to women's problems, who don't believe marriage and motherhood are outdated institutions, who think men are as important as women, who think gender roles are good and exist for a reason, and who see the mainstream media for who they really are. So she's going to defend the traditional biblical role of women and family and marriage and motherhood. And so I would advise, hey, pick up this book. It's called The Flip-Side of Feminism. Find out what feminism is really all about. And we'll continue to do different chapters of this book and talk more about it in future episodes. So hope you find this interesting. We'll talk to you later. God bless. We'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers.